When I saw the neighbor standing at my gate with a flash drive in his hand, my first instinct was to smile and wave, like always. But then he said, "You might want to see what your husband will be seeing soon," and handed it to me without another word. My fingers trembled as I took it. It was light, almost meaningless, a small piece of plastic, but I felt its weight in my stomach. He didn't explain anything, just turned and walked away. I stared after him, trying to make sense of the sudden seriousness in his eyes. Back in the kitchen, I plugged it into my laptop. There was only one video. I clicked play. And what I saw made my breath catch and my skin go cold. There I was. Not at home. Not with my husband. But walking out of the garage. Smiling. Adjusting my coat. Followed by a man who was not my husband. His hand brushed mine. We looked at each other, and that was enough. That was more than enough. I slammed the laptop shut. My pulse was racing. This was real. This existed. Someone had seen. Someone had recorded. Someone knew. The garage, that place I thought of as hidden, safe, ours, it had never been private. And now the damage was already done. My hands clenched into fists as I whispered to myself, how did it come to this? But I already knew. It started 3 months ago, on a Wednesday. A small, innocent visit. A harmless favor. Let me tell you how it happened. But before I do, leave a comment with your city, and tell me, have you ever crossed a line so quietly, you didn't realize how far you'd gone until it was too late? I always thought routine would be my salvation. The same breakfast, the same chair by the window, the same man sitting across from me, flipping through his newspaper like it held the answers to our aging lives. It didn't. And neither did I. But I clung to that sameness like a security blanket, even when it began to smother me. He never noticed what I wore anymore. Not that I expected compliments, not at our age. But still, some days I'd linger longer by the mirror, adjusting the neckline of a blouse I hadn't worn in years, brushing a touch of lip color across my mouth, wondering if he'd glance up. He never did. Our mornings were quiet. Too quiet. Not peaceful, hollow. The kind of quiet that rings in your ears. He liked it that way. "We don't need to talk to enjoy each other's company," he once said. I nodded. But in truth, his silence felt like distance. Like he'd drifted onto a shore I couldn't reach. It was early spring when my car began making that odd ticking sound. At first, I ignored it. Another part of the house, or life, that needed fixing but never got fixed. But one morning, after stalling in the grocery store parking lot, I gave up and called someone. Not just someone. Him. He'd been a friend of the family for years. Used to come over for barbecues when the kids were younger. Our sons played together. I hadn't seen him in a long time, but I still remembered his hands, thick, stained with grease, the kind of hands that did things. Useful hands. My husband's hands were softer now. Paper-holding hands. He picked up after 2 rings. His voice was warm. Casual. "Sure, bring it by. I'll take a look." I remember how hesitant I felt pulling into his driveway. The garage door was half open, revealing shelves stacked with tools and rags, a radio playing classic rock. It smelled of oil and dust and something else, memory, maybe. He stepped out from under the hood of another car, wiped his hands, and grinned. "You haven't changed," he said, though I knew that wasn't true. We chatted while he checked the engine. Nothing deep, weather, the old neighborhood, who'd moved away. But the way he looked at me, not as a wife, not as someone's mother, but as me, that lingered. He fixed the issue quickly, refusing payment. I offered coffee, just to be polite. He declined, saying, "Rain's coming. You better get home." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily he touched the car, how sure his movements were. Something inside me stirred. Not passion, not yet. Just alertness. Like I'd remembered I was a woman again. A week later, I drove past his garage without meaning to. I hadn't planned to stop. But when I saw him out front, I slowed. He waved. I turned in. This time we talked longer. I brought him lunch, a leftover sandwich from my fridge. He said it was the best thing he'd eaten all week. I laughed, surprised how good that felt to hear. Nothing happened that day. Nothing except the slow click of something unlocking inside me. I left with greasy fingers. I'd helped him hold a flashlight, and a smile I hadn't worn in years. At home, my husband asked if I'd remembered to pick up more coffee filters. I hadn't. He sighed, but didn't press. We ate dinner in silence. I chewed slowly, trying to make the moment last. Trying to forget how different it had felt, eating lunch with someone who looked me in the eyes. I started driving different routes. Ones that passed the garage. Sometimes I didn't stop. Sometimes I just looked. But eventually, I always found a reason to pull in. The brakes are squeaky, something smells off, you're good with engines, would you mind? He always said yes. People don't talk enough about the power of attention. How just being seen, really seen, can change everything. He asked about my day. He listened to the answers. And he never made me feel boring for giving them. I noticed small things. How he rolled up his sleeves before getting to work. How he paused to wipe sweat from his brow. How his shirt clung to the small of his back when he leaned under the hood. I noticed too much. And yet, not enough to stop myself. Still, I told myself I was in control. I could visit. I could smile. I could enjoy the attention. That didn't make me a bad person. But the lie was already growing roots. One afternoon, while sitting on the small bench just outside the garage, sipping the bitter instant coffee he always offered, I realized I was waiting for something. A moment. A spark. A hand on mine. Something to confirm that what I was doing wasn't innocent anymore. But that moment hadn't come. Not yet. So I kept going back. Week after week. Making excuses. Pretending I didn't know the difference between being admired and being desired. My husband never asked where I'd been. He assumed. Errands, shopping, the usual. And maybe part of him didn't want to know more. Because knowing would mean acknowledging what we both already felt, that something between us had long since gone quiet. The last thing I remember that month was standing at the kitchen sink, watching the sky darken, and hearing the soft buzz of my phone as a new message arrived. It was from him. A simple line. "You left your scarf here. Guess that means you'll have to come back." I remember how long I stared at that message, "You left your scarf here. Guess that means you'll have to come back." It sat on my screen like a challenge. Not flirtatious, not dramatic. Simple. Ordinary. But that was the problem, wasn't it? It felt too natural. Like he already knew I would return. And worse, like I wanted to. The scarf was nothing special. Thin, beige, with frayed edges. A gift from my sister years ago. I hadn't even realized it was gone. And yet, the idea of it lying somewhere in that garage, maybe draped over a stool, maybe folded neatly on the workbench, was enough to pull me out of the house the next day, keys in hand, before I could come up with a decent reason not to go. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't say I was going out. He was in the living room, watching something with the sound low. I don't even think he noticed the door closing behind me. It was cloudy when I pulled into the driveway. The kind of sky that presses down on everything, heavy, gray, and full of secrets. The garage door was open just a sliver, and I could hear the faint thud of music from inside. Old rock again. He had a preference for a certain decade, loud guitars, echoing vocals, something that always felt like rebellion. He looked up when I stepped in, wiped his hands on a rag, and smiled. "Didn't think you'd come this soon." "I figured I should grab it before it ends up in the trash," I said lightly, pretending my heart wasn't beating too fast. He walked over to the back of the garage, pulled the scarf from a hook near the window, and handed it to me. Our fingers brushed, and I immediately looked away. He didn't. He kept watching me, quiet, as if waiting for something. I hated the way it made my skin warm. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the smell of oil and rust and something older, something familiar. Maybe it was the silence I knew was waiting at home. I leaned against the edge of a nearby shelf and asked, "Busy today?" He shrugged. "Just tinkering. Nothing serious." We stayed like that for a minute. Not talking. Just existing in the same space. It wasn't awkward. It should have been. But it wasn't. "I should go," I said eventually, even though I didn't move. "Sure," he replied. But he didn't move either. The space between us was small. Not physical, emotional. Like we were both waiting for a sign. Something to tip the scale. I don't know who leaned in first. Maybe we didn't lean at all. Maybe it was just gravity. Maybe it was the weight of weeks of unsaid things, building up between glances and silences and shared cups of coffee. We kissed. It was brief. Unexpected. Not rushed, not passionate, not even particularly graceful. Just real. And when it was over, I stepped back, my breath caught somewhere in my throat. Neither of us said anything. I clutched my scarf like a lifeline and left without another word. In the car, I sat with my hands gripping the steering wheel, heart racing. My face was hot. My chest tight. My thoughts all over the place. There was no excuse for what had happened. No justification. I couldn't even tell myself it meant nothing, because it meant too much. When I got home, the lights were off. My husband had gone out, or maybe he was in the basement. I didn't check. I tossed the scarf into the closet and went straight to the bathroom. Washed my face. Scrubbed it, even. As if I could erase the moment from my skin. But it lingered. The next few days passed in strange contrast. Life at home continued as usual, the same meals, the same conversations, the same silence. And yet, everything felt different. Not visibly. Internally. Like I was carrying a hidden crack inside me, one that threatened to widen at any moment. I tried to avoid driving past the garage, but habit is a powerful thing. And desire, even more so. The next time I saw him, it was unplanned. Or at least, I told myself that. I was on my way to the post office. Or maybe I just needed to get out. My hands turned the wheel before I could think it through. He was outside, cleaning tools. He looked surprised but didn't ask why I was there. Instead, he offered me coffee. I said yes. We sat on the bench again. Talked about mundane things, gas prices, the town council, the weather. But beneath it all was the unspoken truth of what we had done. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. That I wouldn't let it. I was wrong. We didn't kiss that day. But the way he looked at me, I felt like I was slowly being undone. At home, my husband noticed something. I don't know what, exactly. But one evening, as we were eating in silence, he said, "You've been going out more lately." I looked up, startled. "Just errands." He nodded, not looking at me. "That's good. You seemed restless before." It should have made me feel guilty. Maybe it did. But mostly, it made me sad. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't ask who I was with. Just assumed. Trusted, or stopped caring, I didn't know which was worse. The guilt didn't come in waves. It came in shadows. In small moments, folding his laundry, hearing our wedding song on the radio, noticing how his hands trembled slightly when he poured coffee. I loved him. I truly did. But I was becoming someone else, or maybe someone I had always been, buried under years of duty and routine. One morning, I woke up early, before the sun. I stood by the window, watching the world slowly brighten, and wondered when I had started lying to myself. It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything that came before it, the smiles, the glances, the silence I filled with meaning. I told myself I could still stop this. That it hadn't gone too far. But even as I stood there, I knew. It already had. The next few weeks unfolded in quiet spirals. Nothing outwardly changed, not at home, not in town, but inside me, something was slowly unraveling. There was no plan, no destination, just a growing sense that I had already crossed a line, and now I was pacing along it, wondering how far I'd go without falling. My days became a careful arrangement of errands and silences. I kept busy with things that didn't need doing. Cleaned drawers that hadn't been opened in years. Reorganized spices. Scrubbed the grout in the bathroom. But my thoughts always drifted. To the garage. To him. To what we did and what it meant. I kept telling myself it was only a kiss. That people did worse and called it nothing. That maybe, in another life, it would have ended right there. But in this one, it was still unfolding. He didn't text me again. And I didn't reach out either. But I drove past the garage more than once. Slowed down, hoping he might be outside. Sometimes he was. Sometimes he wasn't. Either way, I kept driving. Pretending I wasn't searching for something. One morning, I found myself parked outside a cafe I hadn't been to in years. I ordered a tea I didn't really want and sat by the window, watching the cars go by. The waitress recognized me. Asked how my husband was. I smiled, said he was fine, and avoided the follow-up questions. When I got home, the house was still. My husband was in his usual chair, reading. He looked up, nodded, and returned to his book. I lingered in the doorway, wanting to say something, anything, but no words came. I sat across from him and folded my hands in my lap. Later that evening, while folding laundry, I found one of his old work shirts. Faded blue, missing a button. He hadn't worn it in years, but I held it for a moment longer than necessary. Something about the way the fabric felt in my hands made my throat tighten. That night, I dreamt of the garage. Not of him, but the space itself. The dim light, the radio, the scent of grease. It was strange, unsettling, but not frightening. I woke with the sense that I was being pulled somewhere, slowly, against my better judgment. The next day, I told myself I needed new wiper blades. A weak excuse, even to me. But I drove to the shop anyway, knowing full well I wouldn't find what I needed there. Still, I bought a few things, an air freshener, a can of windshield deicer, just to validate the trip. On the way home, I took the longer route. Past the park. Past the garage. He was out front, changing a tire. I slowed down. Our eyes met for a moment, and he gave a small nod. I didn't stop. Just kept driving, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt in years. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying that brief moment. His hands on the tire iron, the sun catching in his hair, the ease with which he moved. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about lust. It was about being seen. Noticed. Acknowledged as someone still alive. The days after that were slow and uneven. I avoided the garage. Not because I didn't want to go, but because I wanted to too much. I needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out what I was doing. But even in that space, he lingered. I began writing lists. Things I needed to get done. Things I wanted to feel again. I kept a notebook in the kitchen drawer and scribbled in it while water boiled or toast browned. The pages filled quickly. With questions. With regrets. With things I would never say out loud. One line stood out. When did I stop wanting my life? I didn't know the answer. My husband remained unchanged. Still gentle, still quiet, still wrapped in the comfort of routine. He didn't press. Didn't ask. Maybe he trusted me. Maybe he didn't notice. Or maybe, like me, he had his own unspoken truths. One afternoon, I walked into the garage without thinking. I had no plan, no reason. Just the impulse to be there. He looked up from under the hood of a car and wiped his hands, that same rag always slung over his shoulder. "You all right?" he asked, not unkindly. I nodded. Just needed to get out of the house. He didn't press. Just gestured to the bench. I sat, and we shared a long silence. The kind that didn't feel heavy. Eventually, he spoke. "You ever think about doing something different? Like, just walking away from everything and starting over?" I didn't answer right away. The question hovered between us, full of weight and meaning. "Sometimes," I said quietly. He nodded, then returned to the engine. I watched him work, hands steady, movements practiced. There was something grounding about it. Something I envied. I stayed longer than I should have. Long enough for the sun to dip lower. Long enough for the silence to grow comfortable. When I finally stood to leave, he walked me to the car. "Be careful," he said. "Not just about the road." I nodded. Drove away. This time, without looking back. That night, while making dinner, my husband came into the kitchen and stood beside me. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice low. I didn't look at him. Just kept stirring the pot. "Is everything all right?" he asked. I hesitated. Then lied. "Yeah. Just tired, I guess." He kissed my cheek, lightly. "Let me know if you need anything." I nodded, but didn't turn around. My eyes stung, though I wasn't sure why. Later, while washing dishes, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked older. Tired. But there was something else, a sharpness I hadn't seen in years. A restlessness that wouldn't go away. I dried my hands slowly, letting the towel linger between my fingers. My thoughts drifted again, not to what had happened, but to what might still happen. It wasn't about him. Not entirely. It was about the version of me that came alive when I was anywhere but here. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep her quiet. There's something dangerous about comfort. It makes you think you're safe, even when you're on the edge of something irreversible. That week, I stopped pretending I was only visiting the garage for errands. I knew why I was going. He knew too. But we didn't speak it aloud. We didn't need to. It lived in the silence between us, in the way our eyes stayed a moment too long, in the pauses that felt like invitations. The morning I decided to go again, there wasn't even a pretext. I didn't carry a broken part or a new excuse. I just got in the car and drove, letting the soft hum of the engine drown out the guilt crawling up my spine. The town passed in blurs. My heartbeat seemed to sync with the turn signals. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, I saw him immediately. He was crouched near the back tire of a small truck, hands stained with black and sleeves rolled high. He didn't look surprised. He looked like he'd been waiting. I parked and stepped out. He stood slowly, brushing his palms against his jeans, then offered a half-smile that said more than words could. I didn't return it. I couldn't. If I let my guard down, I wasn't sure what I might do. I wasn't expecting you, he said casually, though his eyes lingered on mine like he'd been hoping. I know, I replied, though the truth was, I wasn't expecting myself either. He offered me a cup of coffee. I said yes. We went inside the garage and sat at the same makeshift bench, surrounded by the smell of rubber, metal, and old memories. The air was still. The kind of stillness that carries weight. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup but didn't drink. My fingers trembled slightly, though I tried not to show it. He noticed. Of course he did. I've been thinking, he said, not looking at me. So have I. He finally turned. His voice was quiet but steady. You don't have to come back here. I know, I said again. It was the only thing I seemed capable of saying. We didn't speak for a long time after that. Just sat. The music on the radio was low, some old love song I didn't recognize. It made the silence heavier. I could feel the moment coming before it arrived, the shift. That invisible pull between two people who've already crossed the threshold, whether they admit it or not. And then, we kissed. No words preceded it. No sudden movements. Just that unbearable closeness and the inevitability of it all. We kissed. It was over before it even began. I pulled away, breathless, ashamed, but unable to regret it. Not truly. I left without finishing my coffee. I didn't say goodbye. Driving home, I felt like I was suspended in a dream I couldn't wake from. The road bent and straightened, lights flickered through the trees, and still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted permanently in the fabric of my life. When I arrived, the house was too quiet. My husband wasn't in the living room or the kitchen. I found him out back, watering the tomato plants, humming to himself like he always did. He looked up and smiled as if nothing had changed. Everything all right? He asked. I nodded, setting down my purse on the porch railing. Just tired. He returned to the plants, and I went inside, washed my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror for a long time. There was a tightness in my chest, a pressure I couldn't relieve. I wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my side, facing away from him, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing. The kiss replayed in my mind like a loop I couldn't escape. Not because of what it meant between me and him, but because of what it said about me. The next morning, I woke early and tried to distract myself. I cooked breakfast, folded laundry, reorganized the pantry. Anything to avoid sitting still. Stillness brought thought. Thought brought shame. But none of it worked. By mid-afternoon, I was back in the car, not toward the garage this time, but toward the edge of town, the lake. A place I hadn't visited in years. I parked by the water and sat on a bench, watching the surface ripple in the breeze. I needed to understand what I was doing. What I wanted. What I thought I was missing. And whether anything could still be saved. I thought of my husband. How steady he'd been all these years. How he never questioned me, never made demands. But also how little he noticed. How little he saw me. Then I thought of the garage. Of that single kiss. Of how it made me feel, not desired, not wild, just present. Like I mattered. Like I was being watched with real eyes for the first time in years. I stayed there for hours, watching the light shift across the water. When I returned home, it was almost dark. My husband had made tea. He offered me a cup, and we sat across from each other at the table. "I missed you today," he said softly. I didn't respond. I just sipped my tea, grateful he couldn't hear the storm in my chest. The next few days were a blur of half-formed thoughts and restless hands. I avoided the garage. Avoided the mirror. Avoided myself. But eventually, I returned. It was a colder day. Wind tugged at my coat as I approached. He was inside, back turned, humming along to the radio. He didn't turn when I entered, but he knew I was there. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said. I wasn't sure either. He didn't speak again. Just handed me a wrench and pointed to a rusted bolt he couldn't loosen. We worked side by side in silence, and the quiet felt different this time. Not heavy, accepting. When we were done, I washed my hands at the sink in the corner, the water running cold over my skin. He passed me a towel, and our fingers touched again. This time, we both pulled away. I left soon after. No words, no goodbyes. But something lingered. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw my husband through the window, reading by the fire. He looked older than I remembered. Or maybe I was just now seeing him fully. I sat in the car for a long time, engine off, hands resting in my lap. There are moments in life when everything holds still, not because the world stops, but because you do. And in that stillness, you finally hear the truth. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew the ground beneath me was no longer solid. And I had no one to blame but myself. I had convinced myself that I could manage the chaos inside me if I just stayed in motion. Movement, I believed, would keep the truth from settling too deeply. If I kept my hands busy, kept my days filled, then maybe I wouldn't have to feel the slow unraveling of my own integrity. But guilt has a strange way of creeping into quiet moments, no matter how much noise you try to wrap around your life. That morning started like most others. I sat across from my husband at the breakfast table, each of us holding our mugs, saying little. The sun slanted in through the window in strips, catching the edge of the countertop where a small crack had started to form in the tile. He didn't notice it. I stared at it as if it could explain something about where we had gone wrong. He cleared his throat and reached for the newspaper, the gesture so familiar it barely registered anymore. I watched him silently, not in judgment, but with a kind of aching distance. It wasn't that he had done something wrong. It wasn't even that he'd stopped loving me. It was that we had become ghosts in each other's lives, present but unseen. When I left the house that day, I didn't make an excuse. I just picked up my keys and went. If he noticed, he didn't ask. Or maybe he was just used to my new patterns, these unexplained absences I tried to justify even to myself. I drove aimlessly for a while, past the school, the hardware store, the diner where we used to have breakfast on Sundays. I ended up near the garage without planning to. Or maybe I had planned it somewhere deeper, somewhere I refused to admit. He was inside, bent over an engine, music playing softly in the background. The air smelled like gasoline and soap, oddly comforting. When he saw me, he wiped his hands on a rag and gestured toward the bench without saying a word. I sat. For a while, we didn't speak. He handed me a thermos of coffee, and I took it, fingers brushing his just briefly. It was becoming a pattern between us, silence and proximity, heat and restraint. Then, without preamble, he said, "You look tired." I gave a weak smile. "I am." "From what?" I paused. "From pretending everything is fine." He nodded, his gaze fixed on something beyond me. Yeah. That'll do it. There was a weight in the space between us, something unnamed but undeniable. I sipped the coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, but I didn't mind. He stood and walked to the back wall, grabbing a box of spark plugs or some other part one didn't recognize. I watched him move, steady and sure. There was no hesitation in him, no second guessing. I envied that. When he turned back toward me, his expression had shifted. Something in his eyes softened. "I'm not trying to make this complicated," he said. "I know," I replied. And it was the truth. He hadn't asked for anything. Hadn't pressed, hadn't suggested more. It had all come from me, the lingering visits, the long looks, the kiss that still echoed in my thoughts. "We kissed," I said quietly, as if saying it aloud might lessen its grip on me. He looked at me for a long time before nodding. "Yeah." We didn't speak after that. The silence wasn't awkward. It was necessary. When I finally stood to leave, he didn't stop me. He walked me to my car, hands in his pockets. As I reached for the door, I turned to him. "I don't know what I'm doing." "I know," he said, and it wasn't a judgment. It was understanding. Then, we kissed. It was brief. Quiet. No urgency. No passion. Just a slow, familiar moment that confirmed everything we'd been trying not to say. We kissed. And then I got in my car and drove home. The weight of it hit me the moment I stepped through my front door. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. I moved through the house like an imposter in my own life. The pictures on the walls, the dishes in the sink, the slippers by the door, they all belonged to someone I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. My husband was out back, pruning the hedges. I watched him through the window, scissors in hand, methodical, focused. A man who trusted his routine. Who trusted me. And I had betrayed that trust, not just with actions, but with the erosion of honesty. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, the distant sound of a dog barking, the rhythm of his breathing beside me. I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what my life might look like a year from now. 2 years. 10. Would this thing pass? Would it deepen? Would it destroy what little was left of the fragile balance I'd built? In the early hours of the morning, I got up and went to the kitchen. I sat in the dark, nursing a cup of cold tea. And I thought about that kiss. About what it meant. About what I was willing to risk for the feeling of being wanted. It wasn't about love. Not in the way people think of it. It wasn't about leaving or starting over. It was about being seen. About hearing my own name in someone else's voice and recognizing that I was still here, still alive, still capable of choice. I thought about telling my husband. About sitting across from him and laying it all bare. But the idea crumbled under the weight of consequence. It wasn't time. I didn't know if it ever would be. The next morning, he handed me a cup of coffee as if nothing had changed. And maybe, to him, nothing had. But I carried the change in my chest like a second heartbeat. Quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. And I knew it wouldn't be the last time. I started to notice the way people looked at me. Not everyone. Just some. At the grocery store. The bank. Even at the post office, where the clerk usually asked about my garden or the state of my tulips. Now there was a pause. A hesitation before she smiled. Like she wasn't sure what to say. Or maybe she knew exactly what not to say. It could have all been in my head. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe I had let guilt twist itself so tightly around my thoughts that I began projecting judgment onto every glance. But even if it wasn't real, it felt real. The way whispers seemed to quiet as I walked by. The way neighbors suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Just shadows. Echoes of my own anxiety. Until it wasn't. It happened on a Tuesday. I was walking home from the hardware store, a place I rarely visited, but I'd convinced myself I needed a new watering can. As I turned the corner near our street, I passed two women from the neighborhood. They didn't notice me right away. I heard one of them say, "It's always the ones you'd never expect," followed by a low laugh. When they saw me, their faces stiffened into quick, tight smiles. One of them said hello. The other didn't. That evening, as I peeled carrots for dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That the ground beneath my life was no longer solid. That something, somewhere, had slipped. My husband came in from the yard and asked about dinner. I said it would be ready soon. He kissed the top of my head like always. I didn't flinch, but I felt a pressure behind my eyes I had to blink away. We ate in silence. I pushed food around on my plate and watched him pour himself another glass of water. The television murmured from the other room, some game show we both used to enjoy. Neither of us paid attention anymore. Later that night, I scrolled aimlessly through my phone while sitting in bed. A local community group post caught my eye, a thread titled "What's Been Going On Near the West Lot?" It was vague. Too vague. But the comments spiraled into speculation. Mentions of unusual cars, visitors after dark, and even one remark about people thinking no one's watching. I closed the app and set the phone down, hands cold. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between the house creaking and the branches outside scraping against the window. I kept thinking of eyes. Not his. Not my husband's. Just others. Watching. Knowing. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I busied myself with laundry, then organizing the hallway closet. I pulled out old jackets, holiday boxes, a pair of boots I hadn't worn in years. At the bottom, I found a box of letters, some from family, some from my husband, back when people still wrote things down. I opened one, dated over a decade ago. It was short. Loving. Routine. He had written about the weather, the dog we no longer had, and how much he missed me during a short trip I'd taken to visit my sister. I traced the words with my fingers, wondering when we had stopped writing to each other at all. That afternoon, I got in the car again. I didn't plan to go to the garage. I told myself I just needed to drive. Clear my head. Let the wind in through the window. But the turns my hands made on the steering wheel said otherwise. When I arrived, the door was half closed. He was inside, cleaning a workbench. I didn't knock. He looked up and didn't smile. "I was wondering if you'd show up," he said. I stepped inside slowly, keeping my eyes low. "Is something going on?" I asked. "Something I should know about?" He didn't answer right away. He reached for a bottle of oil, capped it, wiped his hands. "Someone asked me yesterday if I'd been seeing anyone," he said. "Said they'd seen a car that looked a lot like yours here. A few times." I felt my knees weaken slightly, but I stayed upright. "What did you say?" I didn't answer. Silence filled the space like smoke. He looked at me. "I think people are starting to notice." I nodded, though my mind was racing. "I don't want this to hurt you," he added. "Not more than it already is." I leaned against the wall, taking a slow breath. "I don't even know what this is anymore." He chuckled softly. Not with humor, with weariness. "It's not nothing," he said. But it's not simple either. We stood there for a while. No contact. No conversation. Just the low hum of the radio and the distant sound of someone mowing a lawn across the street. I should go, I said eventually. Probably, he replied. But neither of us moved. Then, we kissed. It happened with the same quiet weight as before. No urgency. Just inevitability. We kissed. When I pulled away, I didn't say goodbye. I just left. Driving home, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I don't know what I was expecting, a car following me, someone watching. But there was nothing. Just the long stretch of road and the ticking of the turn signal. That night, my husband asked me if I wanted to go to the market together the next morning, something we hadn't done in months. I said yes. It was the least I could do. The most I could manage. But all I could think about was how many more people had started to see what I had been trying so hard to keep hidden. The lie wasn't just mine anymore. It had become part of the neighborhood. A whisper carried in casual conversations and quiet glances. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it would no longer be just a whisper. I didn't sleep the night before. I lay awake listening to the house breathe, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the ceiling settling into its beams, the rhythmic turning of my husband's body beside me. I watched shadows shift across the ceiling until they disappeared completely, replaced by the cool gray light of dawn. When I stepped out of bed, the world felt thinner somehow. Like one strong gust could tear everything apart. I got dressed in silence, choosing a sweater that hung loosely on my frame and jeans I hadn't worn in weeks. I barely looked in the mirror. I didn't want to see myself that morning. We went to the market as planned. My husband carried the reusable bags like always. He asked if we needed more oranges. I said yes, even though we didn't. He made a joke in the bread aisle that made a stranger laugh. I smiled at the stranger too. We were a picture of normalcy. Of routine. Of two people who had built a quiet life and were trying, in their own ways, to maintain its shape. But under it all was a hum. A tension just beneath the surface. I felt it in my shoulders, in the way I flinched at sudden noises, in the way I kept catching my husband watching me out of the corner of his eye. I wondered what he saw. A woman distracted? Distant? Or a woman on the edge of confession? When we returned home, I unpacked the groceries slowly, methodically. Placing apples in the fruit bowl, lining up jars in the pantry, wiping down the counter even though it was already clean. He asked if I wanted tea. I said yes. We drank it on the back porch. The sky was cloudy, but the air was still warm. He talked about the forecast, the neighbor's new fence, a news story he'd read. I nodded. Laughed when I was supposed to. Pretended. When he went inside to take a call, I stayed behind. The mug rested between my palms, still full. I watched a leaf fall from the maple tree, twisting as it dropped to the ground. Something about the motion felt too familiar. That afternoon, I found myself in the car again. I didn't tell him where I was going. He didn't ask. I drove without thinking, letting the road decide for me. It didn't surprise me when I ended up at the garage. My hands turned the wheel as though they remembered something my mind was still trying to forget. The garage door was open. He was sitting inside, radio off, wiping his hands with a cloth that had seen better days. When I stepped out of the car, he looked at me without expression. We didn't speak. I walked past him and sat down on the wooden bench near the back wall. The air inside was warm, heavy with the scent of oil and rust and something older, something like regret. After a moment, he joined me. I thought you might come, he said. I wasn't sure I would, I replied. He didn't press. He never did. Maybe that's why I kept coming back. The silence between us was thick. Not uncomfortable, but full. Like we both understood there were no words left to soften the truth. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same weariness I felt. Not just physical tiredness, but a deeper exhaustion. The kind that settles into your bones when you've been carrying too much for too long. I reached for his hand. We didn't speak. We didn't smile. We spent the night together. There was no music. No candles. No pretense of romance. Just two people seeking comfort in a world that had become too hard, too sharp. I closed my eyes and let the silence wrap around us like a blanket, heavy but familiar. When I woke in the early hours of the morning, the world outside was still dark. I lay there for a while, listening to his breathing. Steady. Unchanging. I tried to imagine what my husband was doing at that very moment. If he'd noticed I was gone. If he was still asleep. If he even dreamed of me anymore. The ache in my chest returned. Not guilt, not exactly. Something heavier. More permanent. I dressed quietly and left before the sun rose. The drive home was quiet. The roads empty. As I neared my street, I felt the weight in my chest deepen. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a long time. The house stood still in front of me. The porch light was on. When I stepped inside, the silence hit me like a wall. I closed the door softly and removed my shoes. I didn't call out. I didn't want to hear his voice. Not yet. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter. My reflection in the window stared back at me, tired eyes, pale skin, a mouth that didn't know whether to frown or stay still. Then I saw it. On the table. A note. Written in my husband's handwriting. Just one sentence. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not blind. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The ink was fresh. The paper still warm from his touch. I sank into the nearest chair. The stillness of the room closed in around me. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, the birds had started to sing. I folded the note and placed it back on the table. Then I sat there, motionless, knowing that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. I don't know how long I sat there. The kitchen was still, the light soft and gray, the note resting in front of me like something that didn't belong to this world. One sentence. That was all it took. Just a single line of ink to fracture the illusion I had worked so hard to maintain. I reread it over and over again. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not blind. There was no anger in those words. No accusation. Just quiet clarity. The kind that sits deep in the chest and doesn't shout, it waits. And that made it worse. So much worse. I folded the note with shaking hands and slipped it into the drawer by the stove, as if hiding it might delay what it represented. But the damage was done. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that asks questions. It was the kind that already knows the answers. He had seen something. Or heard something. Or simply noticed what I thought I'd hidden well. And the truth was, it didn't matter how much or how little he knew, it only mattered that he knew enough. For the rest of the morning, I moved through the house like a stranger in my own life. I cleaned countertops that didn't need cleaning. Rearranged bookshelves. Took the trash out early, just to have an excuse to step outside. The air was humid, heavy with the scent of cut grass and dust. It clung to my skin like the weight of what I couldn't say. When he returned later that afternoon, he didn't mention the note. Didn't look at me any differently. But the distance between us had changed. It was no longer the quiet drift of a long marriage. It was sharp now. Defined. A deliberate gap neither of us dared to cross. He asked if I needed anything from the store. I said no. He nodded and left again. I watched from the window as he backed the car out of the driveway, one hand on the wheel, the other resting calmly on the armrest. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. I stood there long after the car disappeared from view. Not moving. Not thinking. Just breathing. The house felt colder than usual. Or maybe it was me. Later, I sat at the dining table, hands clasped, staring at the salt shaker as though it might offer answers. I kept replaying every moment from the past weeks. Every glance. Every kiss. Every time I thought I was being careful. And I realized something I should have known from the start. There's no such thing as secret behavior in a life built on patterns. You change your route. Your tone. Your rhythm. And even the most inattentive partner eventually notices the disruption. That evening, I drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed motion. I needed the road. I needed to be outside of the house, outside of myself. The radio stayed off. The windows down. I let the wind hit my face and tried to feel something other than dread. Eventually, I found myself near the lake. A quiet stretch of water we used to visit in the early years. Before bills and time and silence settled into our lives. I parked and walked down the slope to the shore, where the grass met the waterline. The lake was still, the surface glassy and smooth, reflecting the thick clouds overhead. I sat on the old bench overlooking the water, pulled my sweater tighter around me, and let my thoughts stretch wide. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't want to. But because I'd run out of tears for things I couldn't undo. What had I been looking for all this time? Validation? Excitement? Escape? Maybe all of it. Maybe none. The truth was, I had stopped recognizing myself long before anything happened. The affair, if I could even call it that, hadn't created the fracture. It had revealed it. I stayed until the sky began to darken. Until the wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to tap against the wooden slats of the bench. I didn't move right away. I let the drizzle find my skin. Let it wake me up. By the time I got back to the house, the porch light was on again. The front door unlocked. The sound of the television drifted from the living room, something cheerful and out of place. I walked in and removed my shoes slowly, listening for signs of change. But everything looked the same. He was in his chair, legs crossed, a blanket over his knees. He didn't look up as I entered. I went into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. I stared at the floor. At the grooves between the tiles. At the same spot where we had once stood on our wedding day, when the kitchen was still unfinished and full of promise. I didn't speak. I didn't know how. He walked in a few minutes later, his expression unreadable. He opened the fridge, took out a bottle of juice, and poured a glass. We stood next to each other in silence. And then, he asked, "Is it over?" My chest tightened. He didn't look at me. Just took a sip and waited. I wanted to lie. To say yes. To protect him. To protect myself. But my mouth wouldn't form the word. "I don't know," I whispered. He nodded slowly, still not meeting my eyes. Another pause. "I just want to know where I stand," he said. I swallowed hard. "I'm trying to figure that out too." He exhaled, not sharply, just deeply. Then he set his glass down and left the room. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time in years. Not because he asked me to. But because I couldn't bear to lie beside someone who had given me so much time, and now, so much quiet mercy. I lay on the unfamiliar mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind against the windows. The guest room smelled different. Less lived in. Less human. I closed my eyes and tried to remember who I had been before all this. Before the distance. Before the longing. Before the lie became real. And I realized I couldn't. That version of me was gone. I didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time, I was beginning to understand the cost of not knowing. I woke up to silence. Not the soft, familiar kind that gently eases you into the day, but the cold, hollow quiet of absence. The kind that feels deliberate. I lay there for a moment in the guest room, eyes fixed on the pale ceiling, waiting to hear a door creak, the clink of a coffee mug, the shuffle of slippers across the kitchen floor. Nothing came. The clock read 7:12. The air in the room was still. I sat up slowly, my back stiff from the unfamiliar mattress, and rubbed my eyes. The sheets smelled faintly of linen and something older, dust, maybe, or the memory of years we hadn't used that room. I wrapped a sweater around my shoulders and stepped into the hallway. The master bedroom door was open. The bed was made. Not a wrinkle. I knew immediately he hadn't slept in it. I moved into the kitchen. The coffee pot was full, untouched. A folded note sat on the counter beside it. Just one line again. Gone to clear my head. No time. No location. No promise of return. I stared at it, my hands resting on either side of the note as if anchoring myself to the table. My pulse drummed in my ears. I picked it up, read it twice, then set it back down with a care I didn't feel. Gone. The word echoed louder than it should have. Because he never did that. Not without saying more. Not without at least a suggestion of when he'd be back. He was a man of order. Predictable, grounded. And now he was gone. I sat down at the table and tried to drink the coffee, but it was bitter and cold by the time I raised the cup to my lips. I poured it out and stood by the sink, watching the last drop swirl down the drain, feeling something I couldn't name begin to spread through my chest. There was no point in calling him. I knew he wouldn't answer. He'd left the message he wanted to leave. That was his way. By noon, I still hadn't moved from the house. I did laundry without realizing it. Folded towels that didn't need folding. Rearranged the silverware drawer, then undid the arrangement and put it back the way it was. I kept walking past the windows, glancing outside as if he might be pulling into the driveway at any moment. But he didn't. Around 2, I stepped out onto the porch. The sun was out now, high and warm. The neighborhood was quiet. A few sprinklers ran in the distance. A lawnmower buzzed somewhere down the street. And then I saw her, the neighbor from 2 doors down. She was walking her dog. When she passed, she looked up and met my eyes. She smiled. But there was something in it, hesitation, or maybe politeness forced through discomfort. I returned the smile, a brief twitch of the lips, and went back inside. I didn't go to the garage. For the first time in weeks, I didn't even think about it. Or rather, I thought about it constantly but refused to act on the thought. What could I say to him now? That everything was falling apart? That the silence at home had finally found its voice? That the cracks I had opened were now wide enough to swallow the life I had built? Even if I went, even if he asked me to stay longer, or offered me understanding, or held out a kind word, it wouldn't undo the damage. Not to me. Not to my marriage. Not to the fragile scaffolding I had spent a lifetime building around my choices. Instead, I stayed home. I waited. The sun drifted across the living room floor. I watched it slow crawl hour by hour, as if its movement might bring some kind of sign. It didn't. By evening, I turned on the porch light just as the first shadows stretched long across the street. I opened all the windows. Let the air move through the rooms. As if it could wash something out. I made dinner out of habit, not hunger. Chicken, steamed vegetables, rice. I set 2 plates. 2 forks. I poured water into both glasses. Then I sat down and stared at the empty chair across from me. The food went untouched. I couldn't bring myself to eat. I covered his plate and left it on the stove. I rinsed mine and put it away. Then I sat. Not in the kitchen. Not on the couch. I sat on the floor of our bedroom. Cross-legged, hands folded in my lap, back against the wall. I stared at the photos on the dresser, of us at a friend's wedding, of a beach trip years ago, of a blurry sunset we'd tried to capture and laughed about when it turned out so crooked. They looked like someone else's memories now. Someone else's life. When I finally stood, it was nearly midnight. The house was silent again. Deeper this time. Like it had settled into its emptiness. I turned off the lights, one by one, and stood at the window watching the dark. Still no headlights. I went to bed without brushing my teeth. Without changing out of my clothes. I lay down on top of the comforter in the guest room, the note still folded beside the lamp. And I waited. But he didn't come home. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not the day after. 3 days passed before I saw him again. Not at home. Not at work. At the market. He was walking out as I was walking in. We both stopped. He looked at me for a long time. I waited for something, a nod, a word, even just a sign that we still shared something unspoken. But he simply said, "Take care of yourself," and kept walking. I stood there for a full minute after he left, surrounded by the clatter of carts and chatter and life continuing around me. My hands shook as I reached for a basket. I didn't buy anything. I just walked up and down the aisles, staring at shelves of things I didn't need, trying not to cry. When I left, the wind had picked up. The sky had begun to turn. A storm was coming. I could feel it in the air, thick, electric, waiting. I drove home slowly. And when I got there, I didn't go inside. I sat in the car and looked at the house. The curtains still drawn. The porch light still on. The silence still waiting. And for the first time, I realized I didn't know if I wanted to go back in. Not because I was afraid of what I'd find. But because I already knew what was waiting. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to face it.